I knew when I took on this role that this was something that was going to be really difficult, but a really important piece of work that had to be done, and therefore making the decision was something that I spoke to the Grenfell community, including bereaved and survivors. There isn't a consensus. I don't think you ever will find that. It's devastating what happened, but what I want to try and do is work with the Grenfell community, the bereaved survivors, to make sure that we do justice to the fact that there is a sacred place. People lost their lives there, and make sure that there is a lasting memorial on that site. So I felt, weighing up all of the different conversations that I had and the engineering report, that actually the only way forward really was to sensitively make sure that we start the taking away the tower to ground floor level.
The whole situation here is very sensitive, but some of those who were bereaved or survivors of the fire felt that this week when they met you, that your behaviour in the meeting was very upsetting. One of them told us the government's ruined relationships with the families in half an hour. It was a car crash. Another survivor of the fire suggested that you were even defensive, even aggressive.
Well, I certainly don't feel like I was aggressive, and if anyone felt that way, then I would be sincerely upset about that. I think what I tried to do is take a really difficult meeting and explain to people and make sure that those that were bereaved had that information and the survivors had that information before the decision was made public.
But something obviously has gone wrong here. How many families had you spoken to about the decision?
Well, I spoke to a number of the bereaved families. Now, the reason I wouldn't give exact figures, because some is how many people in one family, how many people are directly connected, like next of kin, for example. There's lots of different complexities to people who were affected. Now, I know that some people in that room felt that they hadn't been given the opportunity before then. I listened to what they said, and my conclusion was still that there was not a possibility really for that tower to remain as it is going into the future. And I tried to deliver that message as sensitively as I possibly could, knowing full well that it was going to be really upsetting for people to hear that, but I wanted them to hear it from me.
Specifically on this issue of the demolition of the tower, can you tell us now how many families or survivors you spoke to?
I'm not going to go into details of, well, which family, which were next of kin, which were the community, because I think that that's even more insensitive to the various different views. But what I will say is that there wasn't a consensus amongst any of the various different people who were affected by the fire. But the crucial thing that I think the families wanted to get over was that they didn't want people to forget, and they didn't want justice not to be served.
Angela Rayner's handling of the Grenfell Tower tragedy and her response to the concerns of the bereaved families and survivors have once again highlighted the Labour Party's inability to engage with difficult issues with competence, empathy, and clarity. Her recent comments and defensive attitude in an interview with Kuenssberg only reinforced the perception that she is out of her depth when dealing with such a deeply sensitive matter. Rather than providing clear answers, she repeatedly dodged the most basic questions, resorting to vague platitudes and bureaucratic doublespeak, while failing to address the real concerns of the people directly affected by the tragedy. From the very start, Rayner admitted that this was a really difficult task, yet she showed no real leadership in explaining why the demolition of Grenfell Tower was the only viable solution. Her statement was filled with empty rhetoric about honoring the site as a sacred place and creating a lasting memorial, yet she offered no concrete plan or explanation as to how this would be done in a way that truly respects the wishes of the bereaved families. She vaguely referenced speaking to members of the community, but failed to acknowledge the widespread frustration and anger over how the decision was handled. If anything, her response only made it clear that she and her colleagues had failed to secure a genuine consensus among those most affected by the fire. Kuenssberg, in contrast, did not shy away from pressing Rayner on the backlash that followed. The most damning part of the exchange came when she cited survivors who described the meeting with Rayner as a car crash and accused her of being defensive and even aggressive. This should have been a moment for Rayner to reflect on whether she had truly approached the issue with the sensitivity and care it required. Instead, she offered the typical politician's non-apology, claiming that she did not feel like she had been aggressive and expressing vague disappointment that anyone might have perceived it that way. This type of dismissive response only reinforced the perception that she was unwilling to acknowledge any personal responsibility for the breakdown in communication.
Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a few weeks ago from that dispatch box, the Minister for Rural Affairs said that he'd been congratulated by a farmer over the introduction of the inheritance tax. Now, I think this farmer must have been a cannabis farmer, because just yesterday we had 10,000 farmers on Whitehall protesting against this madcap decision. So does the Deputy Prime Minister agree with me that this decision should be thrown in the trash can along with Rachel from Accounts' CV?
Well, Mr. Speaker, he talks about CVs. It's good to see the honourable member doing well on his bench, once a Labour councillor, then a Tory MP, and now a Reform Chief Whip. Every time he switches party, he gets a promotion. Mr. Speaker, I've already outlined what we've done to support our farmers, and we'll continue to support the farmers, and we'll continue to invest in our public services to get Britain back on track.
Graham Stringer.
Lee Anderson's latest attack on the government's agricultural policies, particularly regarding inheritance tax and the impact on farmers, highlights the growing frustration with out-of-touch politicians who push through policies without considering the real-world consequences. In his characteristic, blunt and unapologetic style, Anderson called out the absurdity of the government's claim that farmers were supportive of these changes, sarcastically suggesting that the only farmer who could have congratulated them must have been a cannabis farmer. His remark was clearly a jab at the disconnect between Westminster politicians and those working in agriculture, many of whom have been left struggling under new regulations and tax burdens. His comments came in response to the sight of 10,000 farmers protesting, a clear indication that the government is failing those who form the backbone of rural Britain. The crux of Anderson's argument is simple. Labour's approach to farming policy is detached from reality, harmful to those who rely on agriculture for their livelihoods, and indicative of a broader failure to listen to rural communities. The inheritance tax decision, which has angered many farmers, is just one example of how policymakers continue to make decisions without considering the consequences. This issue is not just about taxation, but about the survival of family-run farms, which often operate on tight margins and rely on passing down land through generations, burdening them with excessive taxes, risks, driving them out of business, leading to further consolidation of farmland under large corporate interests and a decline in traditional farming communities.